Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources will come to order. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are, and welcome to the subcommittee. I'll be filling in as subcommittee chair until Representative Alan Lowenthal is able to join us. We're meeting today to hear testimony on 6 bills that would protect coastal communities and ocean resources from the impacts of offshore oil and gas drilling. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chair and the ranking minority member or their designees. This will allow us to hear from our witnesses sooner and help members keep to their schedules. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Hearing no objections, so ordered. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. Without objection, the member from California, Representative Brownlee, the member from New Jersey, Representative Pallone, the member from Alabama, Representative Carl, and the member from Florida, Representative Castor, are authorized to question the witnesses in today's hearing. As described in the notice, statements, documents, or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository at hnrcdocs@mail.house.gov. Additionally, please note that as with in-person meetings, members are responsible for their own microphones. As with our in-person meetings, members can be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. Finally, members or witnesses experiencing technical problems should inform committee staff immediately. And with that, I'll begin my opening statement. As I mentioned, today, the Energy and Mineral Resources Subcommittee is hearing legislation, including my American Coasts and Oceans Protection Act, to end future offshore drilling and oil and gas leasing along coasts across our country. I appreciate that Chairs Lowenthal and Grijalva called today's hearing on an issue that is incredibly important to my constituents and to many of the members here. And I'm pleased to welcome to our subcommittee San Diego County Supervisor Tara Lawson Riemer, who can share with us how offshore drilling threatens the communities that she and I both have the honor to represent. My district includes more than 50 miles of coastline in San Diego and Orange counties, and that coast is absolutely vital to our economy and, frankly, to our way of life. The beaches in Del Mar, Encinitas, Carlsbad, Dana Point, San Clemente, Oceanside, and Solana Beach draw visitors from across the state, the country, and really all around the world. Oceana has found that the coastal recreation, tourism, and fishing economies support nearly 600,000 jobs in California alone. According to NOAA, there are more than 145,000 jobs in San Diego and Orange counties alone tied to the ocean economy. So when it comes to protecting the ocean and the coastline, the stakes are high. They're high in my district, they're high across the state, and they're high elsewhere, as you'll hear. In California, we will never forget the 4 million gallon oil spill off the coast of Santa Barbara caused by the blowout of a drilling rig platform. That spill in 1969 killed thousands of animals and resulted in an oil slick 35 miles long. Since then, we've seen spills in Huntington Beach, Martinez, the San Francisco Bay, and then in 2015, again in Santa Barbara. These events are seared into our collective consciousness in California, certainly the consciousness of my constituents, along with the fear that it could happen again and that it could happen to us. That's why I was so dismayed to see the Trump administration begin the process of opening up Southern California to offshore oil and gas leasing. You know, back in 2019, when I just got started in Congress, I had the chance to meet with David Bernhardt, who was the Interior Secretary for former President Trump. And I expressed my concerns to him, and I asked him, can you provide assurance that you will respect the will of our constituents, overwhelming majority of constituents, Republicans and Democrats alike, and not allow future leasing for oil and gas along our Southern California coast? He would not make any such commitment, and it was an extraordinary disappointment. In fact, he said, I'll follow the law. However, I was very pleased to see the new administration, the Biden administration, begin to change course and pause all new offshore leasing to reevaluate the program in a comprehensive review. I have strongly urged the current administration to move forward with a complete reversal of the Trump position with regard to drilling off the Pacific coast. Our coast must stay closed to new leasing, full stop. My constituents and their livelihoods must not remain under threat of new leasing. So that's why I introduced the American Coast and Oceans Protection Act to prohibit any new leasing for the exploration, development, or production of oil or natural gas along the Southern California coast from San Diego to the northern border of San Luis Obispo County. In my district, as I said, this is an incredibly bipartisan issue. Cities with Republican mayors and cities with Democratic mayors have written in support, and they've passed resolutions in opposition to new offshore drilling along the Pacific. Congress and the administration must listen to the will of coastal residents. They must listen to our localities, which don't want to see this drilling in our backyard. So the legislation that we're going to be considering today begins the work of getting this done in this new Congress. And I'm very excited to have a number of our great colleagues here. And with that, I look forward to the testimony from our witnesses. And I now would like to recognize Ranking Member Stauber for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. I appreciate that. And thank you to the witnesses who will be joining us today. Today, the subcommittee will consider legislation intended to ban responsible offshore development in line with President Biden's Green New Deal and 30 by 30 agenda. However, today's hearing is particularly tone deaf to the needs of American families. At a time when there are lines of cars at gas stations stretching blocks reminiscent of the Carter administration, Democrats today wish to consider more bills to take cheap domestic energy off the table. From the day President Biden took office to the day prior to the Colonial Pipeline attack, gas prices skyrocketed by 20%. The pipeline shutdown created another sharp increase, making life even more expensive for American families. The timing of this attack, unfortunately, could not be worse. In the last 4 months, Joe Biden banned Keystone XL and oil and gas leasing. House Democrats continued an assault on onshore development in this committee. And now House Democrats want to ban offshore development. Meanwhile, we know that pipelines are the safest method of transporting oil and gas. Even Energy Secretary Granholm said just 2 days ago that, quote, pipe is the best way to go, end quote, to transport these products. Yet Democrats on this committee cheered as the Atlantic Coast Pipeline project was shuttered and the president canceled Keystone XL, which would have been the first of its kind to operate at net zero emissions. This agenda is dangerous. Yes, our foreign enemies are unequivocally to blame for the Colonial Pipeline attack. But taking all fuel sources off the table magnifies our weaknesses and plays into our enemies' hands. Americans are struggling to pay crushing prices at the pump at a time when their household budgets are stretched to the limit. We should be discussing how we can harness domestic resources to provide secure, reliable, and affordable energy for American families. Instead, our narrow focus today is on yielding our energy dominance to our enemies, who just last weekend attacked our pipeline by locking up offshore development. H.R. 2836, sponsored by Representative Castor, would permanently extend the moratorium on energy production in the Eastern Gulf of Mexico planning area set to expire in 2022. Bills from Representative Pallone, Levin, and Huffman respectfully take away any future development in the Atlantic planning area, the Straits of Florida, and the Pacific planning area. My colleagues sponsoring these bills claim oil and gas development cannot occur alongside commercial fishing, tourism, recreation, or military testing and training operations. However, our friends on the Gulf have proven that these activities can coexist on the outer continental shelf and, in fact, benefit from one another. Where we have offshore drilling in the Gulf, we see the most diverse and productive ecosystems in the world, sustaining marine and wildlife habitat and a strong fishing industry. Ironically, these bills would decimate conservation. I joined my bipartisan colleagues last Congress in voting for the Great American Outdoors Act. We know that the Land and Water Conservation Fund comes from offshore oil and gas receipts. In my district alone, Voyageurs National Park needs more than $14 million worth of maintenance. For those concerned about military operations, we have long-standing frameworks in place allowing for coexistence of warfighters conducting testing and training alongside oil and gas development. The Departments of Interior and Defense signed a memorandum of understanding outlining how the departments will work together to ensure that energy development does not disrupt military testing and training or present any safety hazards. The long history of oil and gas development in the Gulf of Mexico proves that balance is achievable if we allow the process for stakeholder engagement and environmental review to work as provided in the law. So let's not sacrifice high-wage jobs, energy security for American families, and ocean-based multiple use for an ill-defined 30 by 30 agenda. Next, the bills sponsored by Rep. McEachin and Rep. Brownlee would impose ham-handed regulations for the sake of regulating. Ensuring that offshore operations are conducted safely is the top priority of this committee and the oil and gas workers who live and recreate in that area. Remember, this is their home. Our oil and gas workers teach their kids to fish and swim in that same water, just like we do in reclaimed mines in northern Minnesota. I welcome the opportunity to work with my colleagues on modernizing our pipeline infrastructure, both onshore and offshore. However, while I appreciate that these bills are intended to ensure safety and accountability among offshore operators, I cannot support these bills in their current form. I must also note that the offshore leasing moratorium imposed by the Biden administration in January remains in place. The law requires that lease sales be held in accordance with the national OCS plan. But this administration has chosen to ignore the law and keep Gulf Coast communities in the dark about their plans for the offshore leasing program. This uncertainty shrouds the future prosperity for the Gulf producing states of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Texas, all of which rely on the family-sustaining jobs, paying an average of $20,000 per year higher than jobs in the solar industry. Further, offshore oil and gas production is a significant source of state revenues. In 2020, Gulf producing states received $259 million from offshore production. Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana use these revenues for conservation and coastal resiliency efforts, just like taking onshore development offline in the West or mining offline in my district and nationwide. Taking offshore away is devastating to our Gulf communities. And as I mentioned before, our foreign adversaries are watching these committee hearings with glee. OPEC, Russia, and China, who all have robust and refining industries, are rubbing their hands together as Democrats continue to kneecap our own energy independence. So moving these bills forward sends a message that the Green New Deal and by 3030 taglines are more important than a reasonable cost of living, high-wage jobs, and a quality of life for millions of Americans. My colleagues and the Biden administration should listen to the people of Louisiana and the other Gulf producing states and support responsible offshore drilling, reinstate the OCS leasing program, and reject the bad policies in front of us today. Again, I thank the witnesses for being here today, and Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member, and we just ask everyone not speaking to please mute themselves. Without objection, I wanted to submit a letter into the record supporting the 6 bills under consideration today from 28 organizations representing millions of Americans. Without objection, so ordered. We'll now begin with our first panel of witnesses, who are the other sponsors of today's legislation. And Mr. Boulay, would you mind muting yourself?
Yes.
Thank you. It says you're not muted. Sorry about this.
Yeah.
Committee staff, perhaps you can help mute Mr. Boulay for the time being. We want to hear from you later.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's go ahead and move along. I'd like to start with my colleague Donald McEachin. Mr. McEachin is the representative of Virginia's 4th Congressional District and the sponsor of H.R. 570, the Offshore Accountability Act. Mr. McEachin, it's nice to see you. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I thank you and, of course, our committee chair for bringing this hearing forward. I'm excited to be with you today. The reason I'm excited to be here is because we're presenting my bipartisan H.R. 570, the Offshore Accountability Act. Mr. Chairman, as we know all too well from prior tragedies such as Santa Barbara, Deepwater Horizon oil spills, offshore drilling accidents can be dangerous, expensive, and life-altering for coastal communities and critical ecosystems. Given the significant threats posed to coastal communities where offshore drilling exists currently, it is critical that appropriate measures are in place to ensure oversight and accountability should accidents or failures occur. I believe that all Americans, especially those in coastal communities dependent on aquatic ecosystems, deserve transparency from industries operating in their waters. Unfortunately, the current reporting system for offshore drilling equipment fails to meet this principle. Currently, legally required reporting of critical offshore drilling safety equipment failures are sent anonymously to Safe OCS, a third-party confidential reporting system, rather than directly to the Department of Interior. Consequently, this information is not accessible to the public nor to members of Congress. This lack of transparency in this confidential reporting system is deeply worrying, and my legislation, the Offshore Accountability Act, would improve trust and oversight. The Offshore Accountability Act is if enacted, would require offshore drilling operators to report failures of critical safety systems, namely the blowout preventer system and safety and pollution prevention equipment, directly to the Secretary of Interior rather than anonymously. The Secretary would then be required to publicly disclose these incidents reports on the Department website. The legislation does not place new requirements on industry. Rather, the bill simply removes the veil of secrecy for the public concerning the safety practices of the offshore oil and gas industry. Excuse me, Mr. Chairman. It is my strong belief that the public deserves to know what is happening in their waters, especially when it involves safety equipment that prevents blowouts and offshore tragedies, to ensure appropriate accountability and oversight of existing offshore drilling facilities. Failures of essential equipment must be made public, and I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting and advancing my bill. Mr. Chairman, I apologize for the state of my voice, and I yield back.
No problem at all, Mr. McEachin. Thank you so much. Next, I'd like to recognize my friend Julia Brownlee, the representative of California's 26th Congressional District and the sponsor of H.R. 2643, the Offshore Pipeline Safety Act. Ms. Brownlee, you're now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing today so we can consider important legislation to protect our oceans and coastlines from the devastation posed by offshore drilling, and I thank you for inviting me to participate. I'm here today to speak about my bill, the Offshore Pipeline Safety Act. First, let me also thank Chair Grijalva and Chair Lowenthal for co-authoring this bill with me. Across our nation's coastlines, thousands of miles of decommissioned oil and gas pipelines have been left to decay on the sea floor. This poses significant risks to our marine ecosystems, our fisheries, and therefore our coastal communities. My bill was introduced in response to a recent GAO report that concluded there are serious issues with the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, BSEE, oversight role over our offshore oil and gas pipelines. The problem is particularly acute in the Gulf of Mexico, where 8,600 miles of active pipelines are not subject to inspection. Additionally, the sensing equipment used to assess the functionality of these pipelines is unreliable, and there is minimal tracking of the underwater movement of active pipelines. Worst yet, GAO found that BSEE has also no understanding of the threats posed by these pipelines to the local environment. That's only regarding the active pipelines. In addition to these 8,600 miles of active pipelines, there are an additional 18,000 more miles of pipeline that have been decommissioned and left on the seafloor. While BSEE was given the authority to allow for decommissioned pipelines to remain in place undersea rather than brought back on shore, this was intended to be the exception and not the rule. In reality, over 97% of the pipelines in the Gulf region have been left on the seafloor. This has been allowed to happen despite no comprehensive studies being conducted on the chemicals and materials that may leak from these decommissioned pipelines or any sort of environmental impact assessment being required. Many of these pipelines were managed by operators who do not have the requisite money set aside to pay for removal, or in many cases, operators who no longer even exist. My bill takes up the recommendations made by GAO, to reform BSEE's practices. First, it would require the agency to finalize regulations to require pipeline owners pay for third-party inspections biannually and to equip their pipelines with modern leak detection systems. It would also require BSEE to conduct a study to evaluate environmental risks of leaving decommissioned pipelines on the seafloor and to consider environmental impacts when issuing a permit that allows an owner to leave their decommissioned pipeline on the seafloor. The bill would add a fee on pipeline owners of $1,000 per mile for pipelines at the depth of less than 500 feet and $10,000 per mile for pipelines deeper than 500 feet. This fee would go towards paying for decommissioning or removing pipelines in the event that an owner files for bankruptcy. The bill is endorsed by Oceana, NRDC, LCV, Earth Justice, Sierra Club, the Ocean Conservancy, and Healthy Gulf, which is Ms. Sartho's organization, who we'll be hearing from shortly. In addition to my own bill, let me also voice my support for the other bills that are being discussed today to permanently ban oil and gas leasing along all of America's coastlines. In particular, thank you, Congressman Levin, for introducing the American Coast and Ocean Protection Act to permanently ban this leasing along the Southern California coast. And I thank Congressman Huffman for the North Pacific Ocean Protection Act, which would protect the rest of California's coast. My constituents in Ventura County, California, know all too well the terrible tragedies that can result from lax oversight, such as the 1969 Santa Barbara oil spill. The scars of that catastrophic event are still visible and continue to have a resounding impact on our region's environment. It is with this history in mind that I introduced the Offshore Pipeline Safety Act to ensure we are proactive at protecting our coastlines from these known hazards. I hope all of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle can join me in helping to enact these needed reforms. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Brownlee. Next up is Representative Kathy Castor from Florida's 14th Congressional District, also the chair of our Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, where I'm honored to serve. She is the sponsor of H.R. 2836, the Florida Coastal Protection Act. Representative Castor, you're now recognized.
Well, thank you, Chair Levin and Ranking Member Stauber, for the opportunity to discuss the bipartisan Florida Coastal Protection Act. I appreciate the committee's consideration today. Protecting our beaches, our coastal waters, and marine resources from the environmental and economic harm of offshore oil drilling has long been a bipartisan issue in Florida. And I'm proud to lead the Florida delegation, again, this Congress, on the bipartisan Florida Coastal Protection Act, H.R. 2836, with Representative Vern Buchanan and 19 of our Florida colleagues. The Florida Coastal Protection Act would make permanent the current drilling moratorium off of Florida's coast that is scheduled to expire in 2022. The bill will ensure that dangerous oil rigs do not come any closer to Florida and will protect my state's coastal communities for years to come. In the Sunshine State, our natural resources and beautiful beaches are central to our way of life, and they are the cornerstone of our economy. The 2010 Deepwater Horizon disaster was horrendous. I know. I looked into the eyes of small business owners. We've all watched it spew into the Gulf of Mexico for months and months and months. It made us keenly aware of the immense risk and the devastating impacts of oil and gas drilling off our shores. We will never forget the lives lost that day. And the Gulf Coast marine resources, the ecosystems, ocean health, coastlines, wildlife, economy, the environment were all devastated by the BP oil disaster. It impacted small business owners, hotels, and tourism. In fact, our state is still working to mitigate the damage wrought by the blowout that spewed oil into the Gulf for many months. The explosion of the Deepwater Horizon oil rig in the Gulf and the fallout from the disaster made plain that drilling for oil imperils Florida's economy, our environment, and our security. Interestingly, preventing drilling off Florida's coast, especially in the Eastern Gulf, also is critical to America's national security. The Department of Defense uses this area for military flight training to maintain military readiness. And this has also galvanized bipartisan congressional support. DOD has stated again and again that a moratorium on drilling in the Eastern Gulf, the largest military training facility in the world, is critical to mission readiness. This is a critical military training ground. So passage of the Florida Coastal Protection Act, as we did on a bipartisan basis in the House last Congress, will protect this area from interference for essential training vital to the safety and effectiveness of our warfighters. We know very well how Floridians feel, too. A huge bipartisan majority of Florida voters made it clear they oppose drilling off of our shores when they voted overwhelmingly in 2019 in favor of banning drilling in Florida's state waters. And as you all know, the version that will protect federal waters passed the House last Congress with a very strong bipartisan majority. Unfortunately, it sat in that large stack of bills on Mitch McConnell's desk, and we never got a vote in the Senate. We need to change that this Congress. We are united in our support for H.R. 2836 because, plain and simple, our economy, our health, our unique marine resources, and our way of life are directly linked to a clean and healthy ocean and Gulf. I appreciate the leadership, by the way, of President Biden, who took early action to pause new oil and gas leasing in public waters and launch a vigorous review of all existing leasing and permitting related to fossil fuel development. But executive orders can be changed, they can be reversed. So it's very important that we act now. There are many other reasons to prohibit unnecessary oil and gas development once and for all, but none more important than our moral obligation to our children and future generations to prevent the catastrophic impacts and the escalating costs of the climate crisis. It is time now to unleash America's clean energy future and protect our beautiful natural resources, the air we breathe, our way of life, the businesses across the state of Florida and across America's coastal communities. So thank you, Chair Levin. Thanks too to Chair Grijalva and Chair Lowenthal. The future of our way of life depends on decisive action, and I appreciate you hearing this bill, and I urge you to move it forward. Thanks, and I yield back my time.
Thank you so much, Representative Castor. Next will be Jared Huffman, my good friend, the representative of California's 2nd Congressional District, and the sponsor of H.R. 3048, the North Pacific Ocean Protection Act. Mr. Huffman, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Congressman Levin. I also want to thank Chair Lowenthal for bringing us together to consider a number of really good and important bills. Mine is one of them. My bill would ban new oil and gas leases off the coasts of Northern and Central California, Oregon, and Washington. And to our ranking member, who's taking some real liberties with the facts today by arguing that the Keystone XL pipeline would have been a net zero carbon experience. Who knew? And that banning new offshore drilling is bad for jobs. I have a very important fact that those of us who represent the West Coast certainly know all too well. Millions of jobs and billions of dollars in wages depend on our healthy oceans and pristine coasts. Drilling would hurt our coastal economy, not help. And regarding the ranking member's claim that offshore drillers have proven how benign and safe and clean and wonderful it is, that is just more of this post-factual stuff we've been hearing from our friends across the aisle more and more lately. The only thing that all these years of drilling have proven is where you drill, you spill. And I want to thank Chair Castor for reminding us about the actual facts regarding the terrible incident in the Gulf Coast. So this is why my coastal colleagues and I are saying no to new drilling on our coast. My district is the north coast of California, from the Golden Gate Bridge to the Oregon border. I have been working to protect this area from new drilling since I came to Congress. Keeping our coast safe from drilling is not controversial in our region. It is obvious. We are not going to sacrifice the scenic, economic, tourism, cultural, and environmental values of our coastal regions at the altar of short-term profits for the fossil fuel industry. The risks of offshore drilling for our ocean-dependent economies and for marine ecosystems is not even close to worth it for us. And the public agrees. Communities up and down this part of the West Coast have voiced opposition to offshore drilling, along with the governors of all three of our states on the Pacific coast. Permanent offshore drilling protection is also good climate policy. Preventing additional greenhouse gas emissions means we're using every tool to help these coastal communities that are facing sea level rise, increased severe storms, and other climate impacts. The bills we're considering today go hand in hand with other necessary actions to reduce emissions and invest in renewable energy, all while reducing risks and making sure that our coasts are clean, safe, and available to all Americans, not a sacrifice zone for the fossil fuel industry. Now, we have an administration that gets it, and they are putting forward thoughtful, comprehensive solutions, but administrations can change. And we saw that during the last 4 years, what it means when an administration has a reckless drill everywhere agenda. We should not leave this to chance. Our oceans, our fisheries, our coastal communities and economies, and our planet are too important to put at risk. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to testify on my bill. We should pass all of these bills, and I look forward to hearing the testimony from our witnesses today. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Huffman. And last but certainly not least is Chairman Frank Pallone, Chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee, representative of New Jersey's 6th Congressional District, and the sponsor of H.R. 3116, the Coast Anti-Drilling Act. Chairman Pallone, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Levin. I like the sound of that, Chairman Levin. I want to thank you and all the members of the full committee, the subcommittee, obviously our ranking member Stauber, and also Chairman Grijalva and ranking member Westerman of the full committee. I often say that Natural Resources is the sister committee of Energy and Commerce, and I served on it for over 25 years, would you believe it? And also, I noticed that we have a lot of Energy and Commerce members that are on your subcommittee as well. So thank you for doing this. This is very important. I'm basically here to express support for ending the threat of an oil spill on the Atlantic coast, including the Jersey Shore, which is where I live. And this week I reintroduced the Clean Ocean and Safe Tourism Anti-Drilling Act, also known as the Coast Anti-Drilling Act. Protecting the coast from offshore drilling is actually the reason I first ran for Congress like 32 years ago. It was the first bill that I introduced when I first came to Congress. And so I've been fighting to exempt the waters off the Jersey Shore from oil and gas drilling for decades. I also did that when I was in the state Senate before. So this bill creates a permanent moratorium that restricts the Department of Interior's Bureau of Ocean Energy Management from issuing any leases or authorizations to allow oil and gas exploration, development, or production in the 4 planning areas that constitute the Atlantic Outer Continental Shelf. And that includes the North Atlantic, the Mid-Atlantic, the South Atlantic, and the Straits of Florida. Now, I did hear what Ranking Member Stauber said before about how oil drilling can coexist with fishing and tourism, and that there has to be a balance. But my response to that is that and I think this is true all over, but certainly in the Atlantic, we don't have any drilling right now. In fact, I worked over the years when we had annual appropriations bills that had annual 1-year moratorium on any drilling in the Atlantic. And then we worked on the 5-year plan, the current one that doesn't allow the drilling. So, there's really no balance here. I mean, in other words, we don't have people working in the oil drilling industry off the Atlantic coast. In addition to that, there's not that much out there. I mean, they estimate that, I don't know, a few months in terms of supply, of oil or gas. So if I have to balance the two, and I'm even talking about climate or here, although obviously this is very important in terms of climate action. But what I'm saying is I can't balance the fact that, we have a few months of oil and gas that risks this huge tourism and fishing and all the jobs that are involved in the Atlantic coast. I mean, just at the Jersey Shore alone, there's $700 billion in coastal property. The tourism industry generates almost 500,000 jobs, nearly 10% of my state's entire workforce. People think of, New Jersey because of the industrial legacy, but tourism is actually our biggest industry that employs the most people. And in the New Jersey commercial fishing industry, it generates over $7.9 billion annually, supports 50,000 jobs, a lot of them in my district. So these are jobs that we want to protect. And I just can't, I understand this balance idea, but the balance is clearly not in favor of drilling off the Atlantic coast. And there is really bipartisan consensus that the Atlantic Ocean should not be open to oil and gas drilling and put at risk of an oil spill. Every single East Coast Republican and Democratic governor has expressed that they don't want drilling off their shore. Bipartisan consensus continue to grow. We have 259 Atlantic Coast municipalities that are on the record saying they don't want drilling. 42 businesses that form the Business Alliance for Protecting the Atlantic Coast. That's represented by Mr. Kais, who's I think is going to testify later. And we have 500 fishing families from Florida to Maine that are on record opposing offshore drilling. And the problem is that our coastal communities depend on a healthy ocean system. We have to protect 1.75 million American jobs and 137 billion in GDP that comes if you want to go for recreation and fishing along the entire Atlantic coast. So I don't want to keep, repeating the same thing, but I did want to mention, as some of you have before I conclude, that President Biden is doing his part. In January, he ordered the Department of Interior to pause new leasing for oil and gas drilling in all American waters. And I worked with my House colleagues, which I mentioned, including several of you who are on the subcommittee, to send a letter to President Biden thanking him for this pause. And obviously, next year, when the current 5-year plan for offshore oil and gas leasing expires, we're going to try to get the president to create a new one for 5 years that prevents the Atlantic coast from being included for any kind of oil and gas drilling. And I also want to say, Chairman Levin, this is not in my backyard. We're very much promoting offshore windmills. The governor, myself, we're out there every day encouraging offshore windmills. We want to move towards renewables. I know many of you serve on the special committee that Kathy Castor chairs, and we do understand how important this is for climate action, and certainly those members on energy and commerce understand that. But But the bottom line, as I said before, is there's absolutely no reason to have this offshore oil and gas drilling. It just doesn't make sense. And so I'll leave it at that and yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. Now we'll turn to our next group of witnesses. Before introducing them, I'll remind our witnesses that they're encouraged to participate in the Witness Diversity Survey, created by the Congressional Office of Diversity and Inclusion. Witnesses may refer to their hearing invitation materials for further information. Now I'll introduce today's witnesses. Lawson Riemer is a supervisor for San Diego County, California. Supervisor Lawson Riemer represents many of my constituents on the County Board of Supervisors. She's doing a great job. She is a strong and powerful voice for environmental protection in our community and so much more. And I am absolutely thrilled she could join us for the hearing today. Tom Kays is the president of the Business Alliance for Protecting the Atlantic Coast. Cynthia Sartu is the executive director of Healthy Gulf, a nonprofit based in New Orleans, Louisiana. Dr. Cliff Capono is a professional surfer, chemist, and journalist from Hilo, Hawaii. And Mr. Graves, if you're on the call, I can't see you, but I saw your name on the list. Are you there, Representative Graves? Give Representative Graves a second here because he's got a couple folks he might want to introduce. Representative Graves, going once, going twice. Are you there? Ranking Member Stauber, do you happen to know if Representative Graves is on? I see his name.
Mr. Chair, I do think he stepped away just for a moment. So I think we can continue on.
All right. Thank you, Ranking Member Stauber. So I'll go ahead and introduce Mr. Chet C. Chazen, Executive Director of the Greater Lafourche Port Commission. And finally, Mr. Henri Boulet, Executive Director of the Morganza Action Coalition. Thank you all so much for joining us. Let me remind the witnesses that under our committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but that their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. When you begin, the timer will begin, and it will turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining. And I recommend that members and witnesses joining remotely use the stage view so that they may pin their timer on the screen. After your testimony is complete, please remember to mute yourself to avoid any inadvertent background noise. I'll also allow the entire panel to testify before questioning the witnesses. So the chair now recognizes Supervisor Lawson Riemer for 5 minutes. Hello there.
Hi, thank you so much. Representative Levin, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to speak today in support of Congressmember Levin's H.R. 3053, the American Coast and Oceans Protection Act, as well as the 5 other coastal bills now under consideration. My name is Tara Lawson Riemer. It's my honor to serve as the supervisor of San Diego County's 3rd District, where I represent many of the same coastal communities as Congressmember Levin. It is clear that we must permanently protect our federal waters from oil exploitation. California is not a state that needs to learn its lesson twice. The blowout of Union Oil's Platform A off the coast of Santa Barbara in 1969 drowned hundreds of dolphins and seagulls in a mile-wide oil slick and halted all new oil and leasing in California waters, state waters. The ravages of Exxon Valdez and Deepwater Horizon are more than enough to compel us to do the same in federal waters. To Californians, our coast is not just essential to our economy. Yes, it provides us with valuable jobs and revenue from tourism, recreation, seafood, and commercial and sports fisheries. But it is far more than that. The coast is at the core of our collective identity. We live in intimate relationship with our beaches and coastlines, our surf, our kelp forest and sea life, and we fight ferociously to protect these precious natural resources. Offshore oil drilling threatens our marine protected areas, Morro Bay, the Channel Islands, Point Reyes, Carmel, Big Sur, Dana Point, the protected waters of the communities Congressmember Levin and I share. There are many reasons to ban oil extraction in federal waters. The most profound, however, is the existential climate emergency that we all face together, and the inarguable necessity, therefore, of rapidly ending the extraction and consumption of fossil fuels. The Biden administration has committed to a 50% reduction in greenhouse gas pollution in the next 10 years. Governor Newsom has committed to banning all new fracking permits by 2024 and ending the sale of gasoline-fueled vehicles by 2035. My own county of San Diego has set an ambitious target of zero carbon by 2035. These emission reduction targets are well within our technical capacity. Eliminating our dependence on fossil fuels and transitioning to a green economy is also the only smart investment for the future of America's economic prosperity. The cost of solar has plummeted 89% in the last decade. We have a clear path to 100% renewable. As an economist, it is clear that the supposed profitability of oil and gas is almost exclusively the result of failing to price the externalities of the fossil fuel industry. If we were appropriately internalizing the climate and health consequences of fossil fuel, the oil and gas industry would be trillions of dollars in the hole. Think of the costs imposed by droughts and fire, flooding and heat waves, sea level rise, disease, and the death of our oceans. These are the negative externalities imposed by fossil fuels on all of us, and they are borne disproportionately by those least responsible for creating them and least able to mitigate their impacts. Young people, children not yet born, communities of color, working families, regular middle-class Americans who cannot afford the astronomical costs of floods and wildfires. In San Diego, in California, we are working towards a just transition to renewable energy. We are creating new and better jobs for workers now employed in the oil and gas industry. We are providing technical and financial support to younger workers and in comparable non-fossil fuel work. And we are supporting apprenticeships programs, living wages, and good union jobs for working families. California's economy is highly diversified and dynamic. We will not only achieve the transition to 100% renewable, we will use our early adoption to our advantage to get ahead in the race to a green economy. By stopping oil drilling and investing instead in the vibrant and dynamic renewable energy sector, we are building new industries to adapt and thrive in the global economy, where renewable energy is increasing demand and oil and gas are facing inevitable obsolescence. It is preposterous in this context that anyone would consider expanding offshore oil and gas development. We have a moral obligation to stop offshore oil drilling. It is also an economic imperative. We can no longer risk everything for the sake of the short-term profits of big oil companies. Californians are trying to do our part. San Diego County is committed to reducing emissions and decarbonizing our economy. But we cannot exceed in this just transition if the federal government is against us. We need Congress to do its part as well. For that reason, we applaud Representative Levin and all of today's bill sponsors for their courage and leadership. It is an honor to share with you the work of repairing our world. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you, Supervisor Lawson Riemer. Very much appreciate that. The chair now recognizes Mr. Kays for 5 minutes.
Thank you for allowing me to testify today. It's an honor to be here. My name is Tom, and it's actually pronounced Kays, but we won't quibble. And I'm the president of the Carteret County Chamber of Commerce, located just south of the Outer Banks. I'm blessed to have one of the best jobs in America, being a cheerleader for businesses in one of the most beautiful places on earth, a place we call the Crystal Coast because of its clean air and clean water. I'm also blessed to be the president of the Business Alliance for Protecting the Atlantic Coast, representing over 42,000 businesses from Maine to Florida. It's a responsibility I take very seriously. I'm here to offer our support for the Clean Ocean and Safe Tourism Anti-Drilling Act. Our members understand just how valuable clean shores and a healthy ocean are to coastal communities and to our local, state, and national economies. Our livelihoods depend on clean, oil-free beaches. My testimony today will address the economic consequences of offshore drilling, as well as the devastating threats posed by climate change, exacerbated by offshore drilling. Decade after decade, the American people are told by the oil and gas industry that it's committed to safety and the prevention of oil spill disasters, yet time and time again they occur. When a spill occurs, it is not the industry that loses out the most. It's the average individual, a hospitality worker, a local business owner, or a commercial fisherman, who with their families suffer from the economic damage of a ravaged coastal community. And unlike large oil corporations, small businesses don't have the luxury of being financially protected by insurance policies when an oil spill happens in their region. Catastrophic oil spills like the BP Deepwater Horizon, Exxon Valdez, and Santa Barbara disasters pose unacceptable risks to coastal economies that depend on a healthy ocean to survive. Toxic oil poisons marine wildlife, causes beach closures, and shuts down lucrative fishing areas. Unfortunately, we know from experience that where we drill, we spill. Permanently protecting our coast from offshore drilling will safeguard our coastal economies from the next oil disaster. That's why we support the Coast Anti-Drilling Act that will permanently protect the Atlantic coast from offshore oil drilling. The oil and gas leasing program on the Outer Continental Shelf has a direct impact on the thousands of business owners and hundreds of thousands of jobs that power our coastal economy. Healthy coasts are the lifeblood of our economy and the backbone of countless small businesses that depend on ocean tourism for steady revenue. Residents and people from all over the world come to our coastlines to fish, hike, golf, kayak, surf, wine and dine, and enjoy our beaches. According to the latest government data, the clean coast economy on the Atlantic coast supports roughly 1.75 million jobs and nearly $137 billion in GDP through businesses like hotels, restaurants, charter boats, gas stations, guide businesses, and gear shops. These long-standing industries continue to make our coastal communities vibrant and prosperous today. Responsibly managed fisheries and well-protected beaches can continue to drive economic activity for years to come. More drilling means climate pollution. We're already experiencing increased destruction caused by climate change, including prolonged droughts, stronger hurricanes, and rising sea levels. The economic crisis that climate change is unleashing could devastate our coastal communities. We must transition our economic values to focus on mitigating and eliminating future dangers rather than continuing a business-as-usual approach to environmental management. Our businesses are facing the impacts of warming oceans, rising seas, and increasingly disastrous weather patterns head-on. Over just the last year, costs incurred from natural disasters doubled in the United States from the previous year. In 2020, natural disasters caused $95 billion in damages. Prohibiting new offshore drilling on the Outer Continental Shelf will help our nation address the climate emergency while protecting coastal communities and millions of jobs. We urge Congress to consider the disastrous economic impact of offshore oil drilling and its associated greenhouse gas emissions have on our communities. For the sake of small business owners up and down America's coasts, now is the time for action. On behalf of the Business Alliance for Protecting the Atlantic Coast, I applaud and thank members of Congress who are working to protect our oceans, beaches, and ways of life from expanded offshore drilling, and for their leadership, such as the Coast Anti-Drilling Act. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kais, and sorry about the mispronunciation. Won't happen again. Chair now recognizes Ms. Sartu for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Levin and members of the subcommittee. I am Cynthia Sartu, and I'm Director of Healthy Golf, headquartered in New Orleans. Since 1995, Healthy Golf has collaborated with coastal communities who love the Gulf of Mexico by providing research, communications, and coalition building tools needed to reverse the long pattern of overexploitation of the Gulf's natural resources. And I am here to speak to the impacts and challenges posed by federal offshore oil and gas development in the Gulf, which I understand is often denied. I will admit that some of these challenges that I discuss are historic, but far too many continue today. The Western and Central Gulf is, of course, the vast majority of offshore oil and gas development in this country, standing at 98% of that production. As of April 2021, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management has managed 2,300 active leases covering 12.1 million acres. Only 20% of that acreage is currently under development and continues to be open to development. Since the 1940s, the offshore industry has installed approximately 40,000 miles of oil and gas pipeline in the offshore waters alone. Only 8,600 miles of that pipeline remains active in the Gulf. Sadly, since the 1960s, the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement and/or its predecessor MMS authorized the industry to leave rather than remove 17,000 miles of inactive and aging pipeline, which are susceptible to erosion, mudslides, and snagging by fishing trawls. Industry drilled around 53,000 wells in the Gulf from 1947 through 2014. They have either temporarily or permanently abandoned 26,000 of those wells, most of which remain and have not been removed, although required to do so. Although required to plug and abandon wells, the federal agencies nor the industry does any rigorous monitoring of those wells to determine leaks or whether there are harmful gas emissions continuing from those facilities. Oil and gas operations in the Gulf on average experience at least 37 small oil spills annually, with a total of 1,200 barrels or 50,000 gallons of oil entering the waters each year. The number does not include the epic BP Horizon disaster or the historic 15-year Taylor oil spill. In addition, the Coast Guard has reported nearly 5,000 oil spill events in Louisiana state waters between 2002 and 2015 from barges and pipelines, and these are only the spills that have been reported. And despite the assurances to the contrary by industry, the potential for another catastrophic spill in the Gulf still exists. One of the latest near misses was in October of 2020, although it was not reported to the public till 2021, and involved the Transocean Deepwater Asgard, an ultra deepwater rig. Luckily, that disaster was avoided. But had a worst case scenario disaster occurred, as much as 313,000 barrels of oil would have entered the Gulf for as long as 99 days, sorry. In my written testimony, I detail many other negative impacts associated with the offshore oil and gas industry and associated onshore industry that have been borne by our region. The conclusions I hope you draw from this testimony are twofold. First, the impact of oil and gas industry in the Western and Central Gulf should serve as a cautionary tale for other regions that are targeted by the industry. Offshore oil and gas development does not just involve a few relatively benign platforms or rigs outside of the coastal viewshed. It brings much associated development, continuous small spills, air and pollution releases, and the risk of the catastrophic spill. Second, and most importantly to those of us who live in the Gulf, our coastal communities have borne a significant burden so that the U.S. could meet its energy needs. It is time for Congress to work with Gulf communities to devise a roadmap for protecting and transitioning Gulf communities. We need not be left behind. At very least, Gulf residents deserve strengthened regulatory safeguards against blowouts or other disasters, robust financial assurances, requirements for the oil and gas industry to clean up its mess, including removal of aging pipelines, rigs, and platforms that pose a risk to all. It is also time to begin the needed transition for our economic dependence on extractive polluting industry. It is true that currently many residents are employed by or in businesses supporting the oil and gas industry in the Gulf. However, industry has already abandoned thousands of local Gulf workers since 2014 in response to low oil prices, and jobs will continue to be lost if, as projected, the demand for oil and gas declines in coming decades. There simply is no justification for avoiding the need to plan for the inevitable transition that faces Gulf economies and communities. We sit at the front lines of climate change, so we understand its impacts. We also understand that big changes are coming nationally and internationally, but Gulf workers cannot be left behind as demand for fossil fuels decline. The Gulf needs your help for us to develop a robust plan that ensures a just transition. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sartu. The chair now recognizes Dr. Capono for 5 minutes.
Aloha mai kako e nā poe I nā kuleana nui no Hawaii mai au. E Hawaii au, mahalo nui no ka lohe a me ka ike pāpālua. Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the importance of protecting our coastlines from the offshore oil and gas development. My name is Dr. Cliff Kopono, and I am a native Hawaiian, a professional surfer, and a marine scientist. I'm honored to provide testimony on how new offshore drilling would threaten coastal and ocean recreation and the considerable benefits these activities provide to our nations. My personal connection to the ocean spans 90 generations. My family first arrived to these islands by canoe thousands of years ago. They sailed against the winds and currents of the deep ocean from a place known as Hawaiki, using the sun, moon, stars, winds, currents, and all the living creatures in it. We consider ourselves as being from the ocean more than we consider ourselves being from the land. I would like to share a little about the importance of the ocean and coast from this indigenous perspective. You see, it wasn't just our ingenuity alone that got us where we wanted to be. Even the smallest phytoplankton helped us discover one of the greatest resources our people have ever seen. True innovation was achieved because we had a delicate and intimate connection to our ocean, something that unifies us across our nations, perhaps more than we think. Coastal and ocean recreation, including beach going, swimming, surfing, paddling, wildlife viewing, and photography is practiced by hundreds of millions of people across the US each year. These activities generate over $130 billion annually from coastal communities, and the nation as a whole. During the last year of the pandemic, while our cars sat idle in our driveways, coastal recreation boomed. People flocked to our beaches and we saw millions take up surfing for the first time. Unlike oil and gas drilling, ocean and coastal tourism is an economic driver that provides a never-ending source of jobs, income, and opportunities for small businesses on every coast. These activities are dependent on healthy coasts, which are directly threatened by the prospect of oil and gas drilling. As you have heard today, there are many detrimental environmental effects of the entire process of offshore drilling, from the exploration through the production phase. Something that is rarely considered is the molecular effects that these industries have on our own bodies. My research in graduate school identified key bacteria and molecular signatures that are found throughout coastal human populations. These populations, in my professional scientific opinion, will be altered at communities proximal to offshore drilling sites. I also believe that coastal populations that are further away will be affected as well. I have no evidence to suggest that these molecular alterations will be detrimental or beneficial, but I do have evidence that suggests they will be modified. This modification of our microbial and molecular composition as humans should be considered in decisions like these. For these and many other reasons, new offshore drilling is widely opposed by communities, businesses, and citizens across the United States. This includes opposition from the Surf Industry Manufacturers Association and the multi-billion-dollar surf and outdoor recreation industry. More broadly, this includes opposition from over 390 communities, 55,000 businesses, and 500,000 fishing communities. On behalf of many in the surfing community and millions of coastal enthusiasts, I thank members of Congress who are willing to protect our oceans and coasts from expanded offshore drilling through their leadership on the Coast Anti-Drilling Act, the Florida Coastal Protection Act, the West Coast Protection Act, the American Coast and Ocean Protection Act, and the North Pacific Ocean Protection Act, and the many other important bills. Again, I thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to answering any questions. Mahalo.
Thank you, Dr. Capono. And to my colleagues, you probably saw votes were called. We'll go ahead and get through our witnesses, and then we'll break to vote. So with that, the chair now recognizes Mr. Chazon for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. My name is Chet Chasson. I am the Executive Director of the Great Lafourche Port Commission, otherwise known as Port Fourchon. I also serve on the Louisiana Governor's Advisory Commission for Coastal Activities, the Louisiana Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority Finance Corporation, and the Executive Board of Restore or Retreat, a regional nonprofit coastal restoration advocacy group. With this testimony, I hope to stress the importance of oil and gas exploration and development activities in the central and western Gulf of Mexico that contribute to the Gulf and national economies, and also funds vital coastal restoration efforts such as the GOMESA program and now with the passage of the Great American Outdoors Act, funding for the Land and Water Conservation Fund. The importance of commercial and recreational fishing and other recreational activities in coastal Louisiana to our local and national economies. And finally, I wish to impress upon you a successful history in Louisiana of balancing oil and gas development with environmental protection and restoration. From a Louisiana standpoint, the Gulf of Mexico and its adjacent wetlands is the thread that sews together our heritage, our livelihood, our recreation, and our homes. And you'd be hard-pressed to find another group of Americans whose culture, character, and livelihood are tied so closely to their natural environment as those of us who call South Louisiana home. Port Fourchon does not itself handle any bulk oil and gas. Rather, we are an intermodal offshore services and supply port. More than 250 companies utilize Port Fourchon in servicing offshore energy facilities in the central and western Gulf of Mexico, carrying equipment, supplies, and personnel to offshore locations. Port Fourchon's tenants provide services to virtually all deepwater exploration and production assets in the Gulf of Mexico, and roughly half of all shallow water facilities. 80% of all Gulf oil comes from deepwater central and western Gulf of Mexico operations. In total, Port Fourchon plays a key role in providing nearly 20% of the nation's oil supply. Translating that to economic impact, offshore oil and gas activities produce 345,000 U.S. jobs, $28.6 billion in gross domestic product, more than $5 billion annually in government revenues, and as I referenced earlier, will produce $353 million or so dollars in GOMESA funding and $1 billion in funding for the Land and Water Conservation Fund. For Port Fourchon to continue to create jobs throughout the economy, continued Gulf of Mexico energy exploration and development is critically important. Robust levels of exploration and development have the ability to energize offshore service companies and their suppliers throughout the country. It facilitates critically needed investment by entities that service these offshore activities, which has a positive ripple effect throughout the national economy. Equally as important in today's world, the offshore industries that have been involved in hydrocarbon production have already transitioned into offshore renewable energy activities. More than 10 years ago, offshore service companies located at Port Fourchon began building vessels designed to participate in offshore wind turbine installation in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic coast. Currently, there are a number of vessels planned and under construction designed to participate in offshore renewable development. It is the expertise that has been developed in the offshore oil and gas industry over the past 70 years, with technology that continues to be developed every year, which serves as the foundation for the growing offshore renewable energy industry. Like many communities throughout the country, we here in South Louisiana face many difficult challenges, including coastal land loss, coastal storms and hurricanes, and fluctuating energy prices. Yet we always manage to rise to the occasion, oftentimes with the assistance of private sector businesses, other communities throughout the country, and from the state and federal governments. The COVID pandemic is the most recent challenge to us, but have remained steadfast, continuing to persevere as best we can due to the essential nature of our industry and the need for continued operation through the pandemic. But perhaps our biggest challenge, our greatest concern, is a national energy policy and government action that fails to realize the tremendous benefit to our nation brought by offshore oil and gas activity, the contribution to our everyday lives in terms of the goods we consume, and the financial security in communities throughout the country that participate in oil and gas development. Thus, at all times, government policy at the federal, state, and local levels need to balance these dynamics, which admittedly and for good reason is not always an easy task. We understand that there is and will continue to be a transition more toward renewable energy to meet our nation's energy needs. We in South Louisiana embrace that. In fact, we're participating in that. But such a transition must be smart, calculated, reasonable, and realistic. Our community in South Louisiana and similar communities along the Gulf Coast thrive on offshore energy development. It would be a tragic mistake by the federal government to restrict offshore development and bring with it certain economic decline to our region and the loss of potential economic gains in communities elsewhere in the country. Again, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chazon. The chair now recognizes Mr. Boulay for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. My name is Henri Boulay. I serve as the Executive Director of the Morganza Action Coalition, which seeks to promote federal authorization and funding of the Morganza to the Gulf Hurricane Protection System. I'm a native of Lafourche Parish, Louisiana, where I grew up along the banks of Lafourche, which is a distributary of the Mississippi River that runs down to the Gulf of Mexico. For the last 15 years, I have worked with our local, state, and federal governments alongside the seafood, energy, and tourism industries, advocating for the building of resilient infrastructure projects for our community, building resilient elevated highways to our working coast, and building environmentally conducive levee systems to protect our citizens' homes and businesses from storm system impacts. As our country and our community recognizes the energy transition, I would like to discuss the leadership role that Louisiana is playing in significant environmental benefits when utilizing GOMESA federal revenue sharing funds to complement our state and local funds expended on our state's coastal master plan. The Morganza to the Gulf 96-mile levee system is the first federally authorized major leaky levee system in the USA. I say leaky because we have our 14th navigable floodgate under construction and have built 9 environmental structures along 60 miles of levees with only state and local funding. Under this system, the wetlands on the protected side, the levee system, stay wet from fresh water strategically held to foster healthy wetlands. In the past 10 years, we have evidence of eroded marshes coming back to life, with the bald eagle population bustling to an estimated 300 eagles nesting in Terrebonne Parish alone. Environmental groups have recently planted thousands of cypress trees in this area. Without GOMESA funding of these levees and structures, this area would be under 3 feet of open salt water. None of this would be possible without the concentration of major assets of our energy industry that have developed in the U.S. Gulf of Mexico, assets which we must protect and prioritize. However, critical protection and environmental projects like the Morganza to the Gulf levee system are at stake with the federal leasing moratorium. Already, GOMESA has been deprived of tens of millions of dollars from the cancellation of the March Gulf lease sale. And we have to assess that BOEM has not put out a notice or otherwise done anything to prepare for an August lease sale. Based on sales statistics from the past few years, these would have been anywhere from $200 to $300 million of revenue for the federal government, with anywhere from 20 to 40 million to Louisiana alone to fund exactly the environmental projects I've been describing. So our environment has been deprived of that support. As stated, for many years, I've advocated for resilient infrastructure along our coast. Please don't tell me that these dollars are going to be easily replaced with other federal funding. I already begged for that as part of my job. To not even let the region generate them ourselves is a double impact. In closing, as our economy reopens and our world moves toward environmentally friendly produced energy, let us remember that under the most stringent environmental guidelines worldwide, the U.S. Gulf of Mexico is producing the lowest carbon footprint barrels of oil in the entire world. While many coastal communities around the country do not endorse offshore production, Southeast Louisiana communities do. And we do it because oil and gas revenues finance our communities, our schools, our public services, and our most significant resiliency efforts forward. Families such as mine work in all 3 industry sectors: oil and gas, fisheries, and tourism. However, it is a partnership with our federal government through offshore revenue sharing that will determine our work forward in community resiliency and environmental protection and restoration of our working coast. We need this committee to hear us and help our coast to resume getting the help it needs immediately. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Boulay. And as I mentioned before, votes on the floor have been called, so I'll be declaring a recess subject to the call of the chair. I would just remind our panel, please do not leave. The hearing is not over, and Chair Lowenthal, I understand, will be on the Zoom very briefly, or the WebEx, to resume the hearing. So with that, we stand in a brief recess, and we'll be back in a little while. Thank you.
Hello. This is Congressman Lowenthal, and I want to thank Congressman Levin for serving as chair in my absence and getting today's hearing underway and pretty well moved quite a bit forward. I'm just going to make a brief statement. Then we can return to I believe we're going to go right to the questions now. Our oceans sustain a rich diversity of marine life and provide immense value to America's coastal communities. They help generate billions of dollars in economic output and support millions of good-paying jobs. Shoreline counties are home to over 125 million citizens, nearly 40% of the U.S. population, and the ocean economy employs more people than telecommunications, crop production, and building construction industries combined. In my home state of California, close to 500,000 people are employed in the fishing, seafood, aquaculture, coastal tourism, and recreational industries, and these jobs generate over $12 billion in annual wages. My state, California, and many other coastal states that members of this committee represent understand that our existing economies are now incompatible with more offshore oil and gas development. California has seen offshore oil and gas threaten the livelihoods of frequently and has multiple times. In 1969, for example, off the coast of Santa Barbara, we saw the worst blowout in U.S. waters until the Deepwater Horizon blackened our beaches and killed millions of birds and wildlife. In the same area, just recently, a pipeline carrying crude oil from an offshore platform ruptured near several marine conservation areas. More beaches closed and wildlife perished. But it's not just Californians that are opposed to offshore drilling. Americans from coast to coast have zero interest in handing more of our oceans over to oil and gas development. Over the last 4 years, Americans were under constant threat by an administration committed to doing the bidding of the fossil fuel industry. Trump administration weakened drilling safety rules and pushed to open up over 90% of the outer continental shelf to oil and gas development. Today, the Biden administration is charting a new course, one that listens to the concerns communities have about pollution from existing drilling and the potential harmful impacts of new development. The Interior Department has paused offshore leasing while it conducts a comprehensive review of the federal oil and gas program, a much needed step that will hopefully lead to reforms. But a future administration might go right back to the Trump administration's playbook of opening America's oceans to new leasing, no matter how much there is local opposition. That's why the legislature we're considering today and the bills my colleagues have introduced are so critical. As you know, the bills authored by my colleagues would permanently protect the Atlantic, the Pacific coast, and the eastern Gulf of Mexico from new oil and gas drilling. With permanent protections, tackle shops, whale watching tours, and seafood markets off the coasts of Oregon, New Jersey, and Florida can feel at ease. And restaurants, vacation rentals, and outfitters in California, in Virginia, and in the Carolinas can count on oil-free beaches and bays for future generations to enjoy. But we must also protect the Gulf residents that live on the front lines and who also experience the impacts of the offshore oil and gas industry every day. Decades, Gulf communities have suffered from spills, air pollution, and loss of wetlands caused by offshore drilling, and then all the required onshore infrastructure. Representative McEachin's bill would hold offshore operators accountable by requiring companies to publicly report critical safety system failures. Representative Brownlee's bill would strengthen oversight and regulation of offshore pipelines, which the Government Accountability Office has identified as posing major threats to the environment, to taxpayers, and to communities. Our coastal communities deserve protections from oil and gas pollution, and certainly that their ways of life won't be jeopardized by new offshore drilling. So all the bills we're considering today will help consider these goals, and I thank the sponsors for their tireless efforts to protect our coast, and I thank them for presenting and also the witnesses in the second panel for also presenting their cases. Now we're going to move forward to the questions, and I'm going to start the questioning with a question for Ms. Cynthia Sartu, who is the Executive Director of Healthy Gulf, a nonprofit based in New Orleans. Ms. Sartu, the Offshore Pipeline Safety Act would charge owners of offshore oil and gas pipelines an annual fee to cover the expenses of removing the pipeline if an owner files for bankruptcy. What do you think of this fee, and in general, requiring greater upfront financial assurance from the oil and gas industry so taxpayers are not left to clean up and remove old infrastructure at the end of the day?
I think that the act and many of the financial assurances that we have been talking about are very important and much needed. Part of the problem in the Gulf is that many of the companies that operate do not have the financial resources of a BP or Shell. As a result, there is a lot of resistance to cleaning up a lot of what has been left behind in the Gulf because it would cost them money or they've gone bankrupt. And so I believe that by requiring financial assurances upfront and by requiring the posting of fees in advance, the Gulf would see a lot of cleanup that it does not now. So I think this is necessary. I mean, if you look at some of the companies, as I said, that operate in the Gulf, it sounds like a lot, but their net worth or their total assets are $20 billion. BP was a $60 billion event. So if, in fact, financial assurances are not sufficient, the American taxpayer will be left responsible for the expenses of any large. And right now, the American taxpayer is being asked to clean up those pipelines when, in fact, the companies should be required to do so.
Thank you, Ms. Sartu. Mr. Capono, I understand that while you're professionally a surfer and a marine scientist, you're also a native Hawaiian with a deep personal connection to the ocean that spans, I was surprised when I read it, that spans 90 generations. Can you expand on what inspired you to engage in the political process and to advocate for protecting the ocean and coastal resources from drilling?
I think the engagement in political representation spans into even my heritage. In the Hawaiian Kingdom, we've had political parties known as the Loha'aina parties who were very vocal about ensuring that our overall human well-being was deeply connected to environmental well-being. So, and that was in the early 1900s, these political parties. So this is something that I think through my lineage, I am inspired by. I used to be very afraid of politics, and I'm very not much an expert in, the sides of the parties and what the behind the scenes interests are. As I think you folks are more privileged with that sort of game than I am. I just would like to express that from our indigenous populations, we have a a very strong connection that is in line, even though people don't feel like they're indigenous to a place. You know, I know there's a lot of natives from Louisiana on the call today too, and as much as you believe that you're a part of the land too, we respect that, and we want to all kind of come together to ensure that we believe that the land and the ocean is a priority. So, mahalo.
Thank you, Mr. Capone. Next question is for Ms. Tara Lawson Riemer. Supervisor Lawson Riemer, according to Oceana, fishing, tourism, and recreation supports nearly 600,000 jobs along California's coast and generates over $42 billion in GDP. How would offshore oil and gas development impact this important economy? Could the oil and gas industry make up for these impacts?
Look, I think we've seen already in California the incredibly negative effects on our economy, on our fishing economy, our tourism economy from oil spills. And that's why after the Santa Barbara catastrophe, we stopped drilling in state waters in California. We know that there's no way that an oil and gas economy that's really quickly facing global economic obsolescence can by any means compensate for the heart and soul of California's coastal economy, which you just described. But to add on to that, it's not only our natural resources and our coastlines, it's also our investments in green and renewable energy that are so vital for our economic future. And that's why, you know, we look at California as really as a model of a diversified economy that is not afflicted with the resource curse and overdependence on oil. And there's just really no paradigm in which trading off our precious natural resources that are the lifeblood of our local economy could at all be counterbalanced.
Could you just finish up if you want to? If not, I'd like to then recognize, if you're finished, then I'd like to recognize Representative Stauber for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Chair Lowenthal, and appreciate Congressman Levin filling in for you. First, I wanted to thank both Mr. Chason and Mr. Boulay on behalf of Voyageurs National Park in my district. The offshore energy development in Louisiana is appreciated more than 1,500 miles north, where we'll put that funding to good use. In fact, every member of this committee that represents a national park should be grateful for the Gulf of Mexico oil and gas development. Now, Mr. Chason, in your testimony, you mentioned the importance of oil and gas exploration and development activities in the central and western Gulf of Mexico and its impact on the local and national economy. Although only recently noted in the media to the cyber attack, gas prices have shot up 20% and climbing since President Biden took office. Can you explain the role that Port Fourchon plays in keeping gas prices low, even for my constituents at the north end of the Mississippi River?
Yes, thank you, Congressman, for the question. What happens in Port Fourchon is the day-to-day activities of servicing the exploration and production of oil and natural gas in the U.S. Gulf of Mexico. So for us to be able to continue to service the industry, providing the energy necessary to basically the feedstock for those refineries to create the gasoline and the fuels necessary for everyone to utilize on a daily basis is critically important, as well as the fuels that we need to provide to Department of Defense for our assets there as well.
And also in your testimony, you caution against an abrupt mandated transition to wind and solar energy. How would such a transition impact the workforce and communities of South Louisiana? And specifically, what would the impact be on the ability of the hardworking men and women of Louisiana to provide for their families given the high wages in the oil and gas industry?
So there's a number of issues with that and with the abrupt move. One is we're going to continue to have the energy needs for the rest of the country. So we're going to have to get that energy from somewhere else, and wind and solar capability is not there. So we're going to have to import more oil. which is being produced at much more detrimental way to the environment in terms of more emissions. The Gulf of Mexico is the cleanest oil production we have in the world. So that's a critical thing that we need to deal with. In terms of the impact to jobs, obviously, the less activity that we have, the less we're doing ourselves in the United States to provide our own energy, the less jobs we're going to have, and that's going to have a critical impact on our communities, on the ability to fund our fire districts and our police and our schools and all the different ancillary things, as well as the impacts that it has just because something is happening in the Gulf of Mexico and in South Louisiana that we're servicing on a daily basis. Those strings attached to all over the country in terms of in California with the different technologies that we need and the vessels to service and you name it. So I'll just cut it off.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Boulay, as you know, last year, the Great American Outdoors Act was signed into law, permanently authorizing the Land and Water Conservation Fund. Now, both the Gulf producing states and the LWCF receive funds from offshore oil and gas development. How would the elimination of offshore oil and gas revenues impact your organization and your ability to do your conservation work?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. The revenues derived from oil and gas, revenue sharing, fund our hurricane protection and our wetland restoration projects like Morganza to the Gulf. Simply put, we could not afford to address the subsidence, climate change, and wetland loss that we are experiencing in a large-scale, meaningful way without these revenues as we are currently doing.
So, Mr. Boulay, I'm out of time, but basically it would disrupt your conservation efforts in a big way.
Absolutely.
Okay. Mr. Chair, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stauber. I now recognize Representative Levin. First, I want to thank Representative Levin once again for holding up my side while I was off doing other business. I really appreciate it. But you are now recognized for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you so much, Chairman Lowenthal. I could never fill your shoes adequately, but appreciate the opportunity. And I want to thank Supervisor Lawson Riemer. I know you've got another obligation, so I appreciate you sticking with us. And as I've learned, congressional time doesn't always match what we think it will, but nonetheless, I'm glad you're here. In May of 2015, an onshore oil pipeline ruptured near Santa Barbara, and it spilled over 140,000 gallons of crude oil, of which thousands of gallons flowed into the Pacific Ocean. And experts estimated that hundreds, if not thousands, of birds and mammals died as a result, and that the economic consequences for our local businesses were measured in the tens of millions of dollars. So, Supervisor, my question is this: if a similar spill were to occur today in Southern California, what types of local businesses might be impacted, and how long would it take them to recover economically?
Thank you. Thank you, Congressmember Levin. I mean, the impacts, the economic impacts would be devastating. A huge portion of our local economy depends on tourism, especially in Southern California. All of that, nobody wants to come to a beach that has been devastated by an oil slick. But it's beyond that. It's also our fishing industry. A significant portion of the fisheries that feed America's and actually, frankly, the global demand for fish are located off of our coasts. Those would all be devastated. That's tens of thousands of jobs. And there's really just no paradigm in which we could compensate for the permanent destruction of our natural resources with some temporary profits from, just going to a couple of big oil companies. So thank you for the question.
And Supervisor, do you think the growth of renewable energy in California reduces the need to grow for more oil in the Pacific Ocean? And do you think Californians would be better served if the Biden administration focused on offshore wind energy instead of offshore oil development?
There's no question that the growth of renewable energy more than compensates. As I mentioned in my testimony, the cost of solar has decreased 89% in the last few years alone. And we are well on the way for the cost of renewables to be significantly lower than the cost of oil and gas. And that's because we are making the investments in those sectors. And we're not only decreasing the costs of renewables, we're also increasing jobs in a new green economy that's putting California on the cutting edge of being prepared to be competitive in a global economy. And as an economist who did much of my own research on the resource curse, I look at the states across our great nation that are more and more oil dependent, and those are the ones that often have the highest rates of child poverty, the least diversified economies, and the least long-term well-being for their citizens. So we know that economies do better when we get off our dependence on oil and gas, and that's what we're doing in California, and that's what I really hope Congress can take a step forward to doing for our country.
Thank you for that. And Supervisor, in your open, you mentioned a bit about this, but can you further describe some of the ways San Diego County has and will continue to be impacted by climate change?
The ways are innumerable. Let's just begin with the fact that we are seeing rising sea levels and increases in flooding in our coastal regions. We also are seeing significant increases in wildfires. As a supervisor who's fundamentally responsible for the well-being of our communities that are impacted by wildfires, thousands of homes that are burned down. These are astronomical costs being borne by working class and middle class Californians and San Diegans in particular. Rising wildfires, rising sea levels. These are some of the most immediate consequences. There's also consequences in terms of our decreased biodiversity, decreased supplies and resilience of our fishery stocks. We know that the rising levels of CO2 in our oceans are making our reefs much more fragile, which is decreasing the availability of plankton and ecoplankton for the entire food chain. So there's long-term consequences on the viability of our fisheries. We're seeing the beginning of the collapse of our fisheries, which not only impacts our food systems, but also impacts the workers who rely on fisheries as a source of income. So the consequences, frankly, are catastrophic, innumerable, and are being borne most heavily by those who are least able to cope with those kinds of consequences. And we see that in the communities who are so severely impacted by wildfires, but we see it in so many different ways as well.
I am out of time, Mr. Chairman, but I just want to thank the supervisor for excellent leadership in San Diego County, for joining us. And I look forward to seeing you and your team back in the district, Supervisor. And thanks so much. Have a great rest of your day. And Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back. Muted, Mr. Chairman.
I thank you, Representative Levin. I now recognize Representative Graves for 5 minutes of questions. Representative Graves.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity to join you today. Did we just lose our supervisor? We did. Oh, shoot. Yeah, that's disappointing. Well, maybe, Mr. Levin, I can ask you the questions. So, hey, I want to thank the witnesses for testifying today. It's especially great to see all of our Louisiana folks, Chet and Henri and Sin. Good to see y'all. Hope everybody's doing well. So I was interested. I actually am going to pick up my California friends in just a minute. Mr. Lowenthal, Mr. Levin. So I heard all this talk about how fantastic wind is and prices are plummeting. And so could y'all tell us and just invite the committee, inform the committee a little bit about the offshore wind production that is occurring in Southern California today?
That for either of us? Well, I know it's being studied and that a lot of the conventional methods of offshore wind won't work in Southern California for a variety of reasons, but Biden administration has been focused on the Northeast, as you know, with the new 800 megawatt project there. But I think we're going to keep looking at it. To the extent it's those floating turbines, it's going to be more expensive. But I know they're doing it in Scotland and some other places, but it may or may not work in California. We'll see. But we're not going to do anything that where on balance, the environmental harm outweighs the environmental externalities are negative. We're not going to go in that direction.
All right, so I just want to make the point that all this talk about how this is a great technology and it's affordable and this is what we need to be doing, and it's not even in place in California, which certainly judging by the barometer that my good friends here, Mr. Lowenthal, Mr. Levin, and other Californians on the committee, it's an embraced technology, and it doesn't even exist in California, which goes back to, as my friend Mr. Levin just noted, the limitations on the technology. You're right, it shelves too deep there, and so it's not a technology that's necessarily interchangeable. So if the supervisor was still here, I'm curious because in her testimony she made mention over basically stopping or how the spill in the 1960s off California, how that was so devastating and how there's therefore no leasing in state waters. However, there is production, as we all know, in federal waters today off the state of California. Number two, I want to remind folks that the state of California is the most dependent state upon imported energy, meaning energy coming from other countries or other states. If we're not going to produce, then what it does is it requires that be brought in by tanker, which is an example that was stated in her testimony. Tankers are a less safe mechanism of transportation than, let me actually quote Energy Secretary Granholm, who just said days ago that pipes are the safest way to transport energy. And so she's talking effectively about using a less safe way to transport energy that would potentially have environmental consequences on the state of California. Let me go to Mr. Chasson. Mr. Chasson, I heard talk about the adverse impact on fisheries and the ecosystem as a result of energy production. Could you talk a little bit about some of your experiences with ecological productivity in the Gulf of Mexico, where you have the largest abundance of energy infrastructure, I believe, in the world?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. Yeah, I mean, when the fisheries in South Louisiana and offshore the coast, in particular offshore Port Fourchon, every one of those structures that's offshore is an artificial reef. It's creating a habitat for the aquatic wildlife. And when I enjoy fishing, and when I do go fishing, I go fishing near a rig or a facility offshore. I believe, and you say it very well, Representative, in many times that you speak, I believe Louisiana in the continental United States has the largest impact on fisheries, and we have the largest service base for the offshore oil and gas industry. So they do not correlate against one another. They actually work very well together.
Thank you, Mr. Chasson. Mr. Chairman, you're back.
And before I call the next witness, which will be I want to thank Mr. Chasson for being a wonderful host when I came to Louisiana, and also talking about the fishing. I would like to remind the Congressman who caught the most fish when we were fishing. But with that, I would like to now call on Representative.
That's because we put the scuba diver on your hook. We made sure the scuba diver was putting the fish on your hook.
That's it. Representative Porter. You're recognized for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'd like to start by asking unanimous consent to enter into the record this oral history of the 1969 Santa Barbara oil spill. Mr. Chair.
Without objection, it will be entered.
Thank you. There's a reason that we have 3 members from Southern California sitting on the subcommittee, and why more than 73% of Californians are against more drilling. I challenge anyone to read this and not to think twice about the importance of environmental safeguards and the dangers of reckless oil and gas development, especially when safer alternatives are available. Ms. Sarthow, last month, the U.S. Government Accountability Office reported that there are 8,000 miles of abandoned, unused pipelines running along the seafloor of the Gulf of Mexico alone. Operators are supposed to remove old pipes, but the Department of Interior can grant a waiver to decommission them instead. Do you have any idea what percentage of pipelines have that waiver?
It's my understanding that about 97% of the pipelines in the offshore since 1960 have been given a waiver of removal.
So it's more like the not removing is the common thing. 97% of the time we don't remove the pipeline. So it's
Correct.
not so much as a waiver as it is what always happens. Does Interior then verify, though, that the operators are decommissioning those pipelines that are left in place correctly, making sure that they are cleaned and buried to prevent pollution?
It is my understanding that there is actually no program by which the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement goes out and regularly monitors, either monitors at the time of shutdown or monitors over time, whether there has been erosion or damage to any of those pipelines. And most of them are in relatively deep water.
But there must be some kind of bond. So if the pipes left in place via this waiver that are not inspected do actually prove dangerous or leak, that companies are going to be the ones to have to pay for removal and cleanup. So tell me about that bond program to protect taxpayers.
It is not my, to my knowledge, there is no bond program, nor is there in any program by which industry is required to go in and pay for the damage other than the Coast Guard, the OPA, Oil Pollution Act. If there was an actual spill that required response, the Coast Guard would try to call on those companies. The problem is a lot of those companies no longer exist. They have gone bankrupt or out of business.
So I want to get this straight. Oil companies are supposed to remove their pipelines. There are special they get permission 97% of the time to not do it, to leave them in place. The US has no system to monitor those pipelines to see if leaving them in place is actually creating environmental harm. And there's no source of funds from the oil companies themselves to remove or repair them if they are polluting. Is that correct?
True to the best of my knowledge, other than the Oil Pollution Act, which is not frequently implemented in a smaller spill scenario.
I think that's outrageous and doesn't make a whole lot of sense to have a rule and then 97% of the time do something different, to require, to say that companies have to clean up after themselves, but then not actually require them to have any fun to do so. I want to turn to Dr. Capono, and I want to show you the only known picture of me ever standing on a surfboard. And it's the only picture because it's actually maybe the only time I've ever gotten up. And when I paddle out, I'm just focusing on not dying, trying not to run into people, trying to hang onto my board, wondering if I put my leash on correctly. But when you go out as an amazing surfer, and late at night when I'm stressed out about the Natural Resources Committee, I like to watch surfing footage. When you go out, both as a scientist and as a surfer, you see things. You see pollution in the water that I don't see as a casual user. Can you tell me a little bit about your research, especially the Surfer Biome Project?
Yes, like I said, just to be truthful about my work, I look at the microbiome and the metabolomic composition of the human body. That's my specialty. So knowing, again, if these types of effects, the potential effects of a spill or something like that, how it affects the human, that's not my expertise. But I do know that these types of modifications into the natural environment do have an implication on our entire microbiome or composition. We're composed of millions of different molecules and bacteria and fungus that, depending on their frequency on the natural world, it's going to alter it. And these microbes, we call them, have a huge impact on keeping us healthy and protecting us from disease. So, with the potential of disrupting the natural world with a spill, I would say that there has a big implication that we need to now revisit our health programming just to monitor and see what that type of effects. And I'm not sure what the medical burden that would be on these communities, but I would say that from my scientific background, I would say it's a definite consideration to have, is that implication.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Surfer Porter. And now I'd like to call Representative Westerman.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. And as much as I would love to get more involved in this conversation, I really like to hear my friend Garrett Graves from Louisiana, who has all kinds of firsthand knowledge about offshore production, the benefits of it. And I'm going to yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Westerman. I appreciate that. It's interesting just continuing to hear all this discussion. There are two people that are on this panel right now that actually live and have grown up in the vicinity of these communities that are producing all of this energy. So it's interesting to hear the thought that there's a belief that these folks would actually work to promote, to contaminate their own communities. Dr. Capano, did I get that right? Close? All right, thank you. How much oil is released naturally into the environment each year? I heard the discussion about microbes a little while ago.
The question is how much oil is released into the environment?
Naturally released.
So this becomes a conversation of what we define as natural, what we define as organic. As a scientist, I believe that there's just a difference of where this carbon is coming from the top of the earth or from very deep within the earth. So I'm
talking about within the, I should have clarified, within the oceans.
How much oil is released? That's not my expertise. I'm unaware of the exact number.
Yeah. So just to put things in perspective, there's about 5 million gallons of oil that is released every year just through natural seeps, including off the coast of California, Southern California in particular. So it's a pretty sizable volume. I heard all sorts of statements much earlier in this hearing about how all of these spills were increasing, and the reality is there is a very, very clear trend of downward volume and downward in terms of the number of individual incidents of spills. And I don't think we can say this enough. And Mr. Boulay, I'd love for you to talk about this. You grew up in a seafood family, a family that benefited off of the bounty of the Gulf of Mexico. Could you talk about perhaps some of the environmental standards, the safety standards, and just the sort of the cleanliness and the recognition of the culture and community of energy production in the U.S. versus any experience or knowledge you may have about what happens internationally?
Absolutely, Congressman, and thank you for the question. So there was research done during the Obama administration. It was a DOE report called the OCS and Oil and Natural Gas, Potential Life Cycle Greenhouse Gas Emissions, and the Social Cost of Carbon. So it was in that study that they looked at production around the world and compared the emissions occurring in production in the Gulf of Mexico. And that study, determined that basically the Gulf of Mexico had the lowest carbon output per barrel of oil worldwide. Okay. In my growing up, in Southeast Louisiana, on a shrimp boat along the coast, and then, on our crawfish farm right inland, we shrimped. We didn't experience clumps of oil and things like that. Now, when you walked along the beach, there were natural little pieces of oil tar that would wash up. I think that references what what you were inquiring about in natural oil seeping from the ocean bottoms, okay? It wasn't from spills. So in the sense of the fisheries community and the oil and gas community working in union, I've gone out of the ports of Grand Isle, Port Fourchon, and those two communities, often you have a family member that works on maybe a service vessel and you're on the shrimp boat, and you communicate and you work in union.
Hey, thank you, Mr. Boulay. Mr. Chairman, I want to yield back, but I want to also tell you that I'd be happy to work with you to look back and see why the Obama administration did not put a rule in place on leaving pipeline and infrastructure in place. I do understand the Trump administration actually worked to finalize a rule, but I also know that that is important habitat that in some cases is left intentionally for reef structure. Yield back.
I yield back.
Is Mr. Huffman here? I'm Congressman Lowenthal. I'm calling on Mr. Huffman. Is Mr. Huffman here? If not, Representative Gosar, you have 5 minutes of time for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're here today again as my colleagues continue their efforts to shut down America energy drilling. We have been through the cycle before, and once again, what can we say? Instead of advocating for American jobs and American energy, we're here to shut stuff down. The majority wants to close down offshore drilling off of California. Meanwhile, last year, California imported nearly 30 million barrels of oil from Colombia, a significant amount produced offshore. In addition to meet the continued demand from places like California, Colombia has 8 major offshore drilling projects ongoing. So instead of exploring and producing the California offshore under the world's best offshore drilling environment regime while employing American workers, we are exporting our demand to Colombia, depending on their workers and, more importantly, their environmental regulatory regime, which I would believe is a lot less than what we have. I think it's backwards. And as we try to understand the thinking of the majority, it seems like they simply don't seem to understand that energy production is all about trade-offs. In this case, American workers for foreign workers, American environmental standards for foreign standards, and American security for insecurity. While we're on the important topic of offshore energy, I want to highlight that the hearings we held last year and earlier this year have raised important concerns about the makeup of the offshore workforce, particularly when it comes to individuals working on foreign worker visas. I think that issue is something we could be spending some more time on focusing our efforts on, and hope in the future we can address that important issue. Now I want to yield the rest of my time to the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Graves. Is Mr. Graves there?
Let me just.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, Mr. Gosar. I'm really curious. We've got Mr. Boulay brought up this report that was issued during the Obama administration, indicating effectively that Gulf of Mexico energy was some of the cleanest in the world, and also that when you stop producing, let me be clear, an Obama administration report found that when you stop producing offshore oil, or if you stop lease sales, that what happens is you end up becoming more dependent upon foreign sources of energy. Let's play this out a little bit. We just watched as foreign actors, probably with state blessing, hack the pipeline, the Colonial Pipeline. And let me say that again, probably with state blessing from Russia. And so that effectively is putting foreign actors in charge of domestic energy. The Obama administration's report found that by shutting down lease sales, by stopping domestic production, that effectively you're handing over the keys. You're handing over the keys to Russia. In the Obama report, that's what they say. It's really baffling to me to hear how people can talk about, from an environmental perspective, how this is what makes sense, we watched them hack and shut down a pipeline. and obviously didn't have permission. Yet in this case, we've got policies being carried out that's trying to shut down the most environmentally sensitive, the lowest emissions energy, oil and gas production, and turning over the keys willingly to Russia. I just, Mr. Chasson, could you just comment on that? And if you think that it makes more sense to put Russia in charge or to shut down domestic production of offshore energy?
Thank you, Congressman. No, I mean, that's an easy question to answer. It's never good to put our energy needs into the hands of someone else. And it reduces our homeland security, reduces our energy security, and it just makes us weaker. And as the price of energy increases in our country, the price of everything else increases. So it has a rippling. It's not a trickle down. It's a trickle up effect on every family, every household in the United States, and that's just something that we can't manage, especially now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I got to yield back to Mr. Gosar. I got to go vote.
Chairman, thank you.
I believe, Mr. Gosar, you have completed your questions. Yes, Mr. Gosar?
I have. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Gosar. I now recognize Mr. Tiffany there. Is Representative Carl there? I recognize Representative Carl for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, as someone that lives on the Gulf Coast, I'm astounded that we're not talking about how we have benefited with knowledge from the disasters that we've had in the past. The BP oil spill that happened off the coast of Louisiana affected all of us. It affected us in Mississippi. It affected us in Alabama. What we learned from that, we have grown leaps and bounds from an environmental standpoint. We're so much better. In Alabama, if you come to Alabama, I'll take you to a 10-acre storage facility that's paid for by 100% by the oil companies. 2 of every piece of equipment, whether it's robotic or whether it's manual, is stored in this facility. It's at a port. It's within minutes of being loaded on a ship and a quicker response system in the Gulf. We understand how important it is to stop that oil from leaking. Now, what we're not talking about is the jobs that come from that. I realize California and I realize our friends in Florida do not want to look at oil wells or rigs out the Gulf. I get it. I understand it. We in Alabama are willing to pay that price. We understand we are feeding the central part of America with natural gas. You heat your home, the chances are it's coming out of the oil fields south of Mobile and the Gulf. So to cut these permits off and to stop not allowing new drilling, you're going to affect every household in the central portion of America. And it is ridiculous. We don't need to have that. My question, Dr. Capuno, if I pronounce that correctly, are you a microbiologist, marine biologist?
It's Capuno, and I'm an analytical chemist.
Okay.
Yes.
So are you aware we do have microorganisms that eats that oil that's leaking out of this 5 million gallons that's being released naturally by nature? We have bacteria that eats that, correct?
I'm aware that there are bacteria that consume.
Okay, so we have a natural system that God has created that deals with the leakage here. No one wants the leakage, but let me tell you what came from the BP oil spill. I have an army of environmentalists that are out there every day fishing these rigs. An army. They see any oil leaks, they are reporting it. Every fisherman that goes out on that water is an environmentalist. And to think that only quote unquote registered environmentalists protect our waters is asinine. I've got thousands that leave the docks every day in South Alabama and South Mississippi. I'll just speak for those two. So from the environmental side, we are very, very conscious of what's going on. We truly are. We're watching for these leaks, and we need to be watching for these leaks. And where we're at, my father worked oil rigs back in the 60s and 70s. He ran supply boats. And what they used to do is when they got an oil leak, they would take Tide detergent and cover that oil leak with Tide detergent, and it would sink to the bottom. And these bacteria would eat it. No one would ever know it was an oil leak. They don't do that anymore. We've cleaned that up. That's changed. We have come light years from an environmental standpoint from where we were. So I get real offended when environmentalists tell us how horrible we are with our environment. In reality, we are much better. What we have is more people creating more issues, and we have to deal with that. But, you know, I beg, I plead, let's look at these oil leases. What is dependent on these oil leases? There are thousands and thousands of jobs. Are you going to tell all these people that they can no longer work? Don't tell me they're going to go make solar screens. I'm sorry, doctor, I'm not talking to you anymore. But I see you smile. You're off the hook. Thank you, sir. But you know, we've got all these jobs, and a lot of them are union jobs. So to my friends on the other side of the aisle, think about that before you rush to shut these permits off. Let's look at the positive side of what we have learned from our mistakes. Let's look at these facilities that we have, that they have spent millions and millions of dollars to quick respond to in these times of disasters. Disasters will happen. I will not argue that with anyone. But you look at these empty pipelines and the amount of oil that should be, now I'll agree with that part. They should be empty. The leakage from that, chances are going to be eaten by these very bacteria that we're talking about. Now, what good are these pipelines doing us right now? We've been doing a snapper study, and our snapper study is way off the chart. We had no idea we had so many snapper. Do you know where the snapper are developing on? The pipeline itself. They are hovering to this pipeline. So we've got an explosion in red snapper, and it's all due to these pipelines that, again, that you're talking negative about. I don't want to say we shouldn't turn our attention off of it. We should be respectful of it, but it's our natural resources, and we need those natural resources. Folks in California, folks in Florida want to drive their cars. They want to heat their homes. You need the oil and the gas we are producing. So I beg you to stop and slow up, and let's reconsider this entire bill, because what we're proposing to do here is to turn our future over to foreign countries, and I can't stand for it. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield my time back to you, and I appreciate the chance to speak.
Thank you, Representative Carl. I appreciate that. Are there any other members who have not spoken that wish to address ask questions of members on the panel? Any other members? Speak up now. If not, I'm going to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we're going to ask you witnesses to respond to these in writing. Under Committee Rule 3-0, members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing. And the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. If there's no further business, without objection, this subcommittee stands adjourned.